Good morning. Welcome to the Sunday morning worship of First Unitarian Church of Omaha. I am Nadine Keith. I'm your worship associate this morning. Glad to see all of you on this sunny, if cold, Sunday morning. I want to encourage you all to pick up the blue sheets of announcements. You probably learned by now we're not including them in the order of service anymore. That doesn't mean we don't want you to pay attention. So take a sheet or scan this little device in the corner of your order of service if you're of the bent to do that as a way of accessing information. Please learn what's happening here and what we're doing out in the community as ways of being involved and being of service. I particularly want to call attention to the holiday dinner insert that's coming up on the first Saturday in December, and it's a social event for all of the adults in the congregation. We hope that many of you are able to attend. It's a wonderful social hour, and it helps us start the holiday season. I also want to call attention to the First Steps class, which is on the 25th after worship service. And it's the chance to get acquainted with the basics of Unitarian Universalism and this church in particular. And it's conducted by Carrie, our membership coordinator. So find out what's going on, find a way to be involved, and participate in both serving and in feeding your own souls.
Whoever you are, wherever you come from, wherever you find yourself on your life's journey, whether you've walked in or rolled in, whomever you love, you are welcome here. Each of us brings our own truth here.
We bring the truth of our own life, our own story.
We don't come as empty vessels, but as full people.
Each
With our own story and our own truth.
We seek to add our truths and to add to our stories. This room is rich with truth, rich with experience.
All manner of people are here. Needy, joyful, frightened, anxious, bored.
We all bring our truth with us.
May we all recognize the truth and the story in lives other than our own. May we hear and honor the truths that we all bring as we gather together.
Together we have truths.
Together we have a story. Together we are a community. Jan? Chalice lady? So do we have any other young people for the chalice lighting this morning? One more. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. Please join us for number 68, Come Ye Thankful People. Those of you who are young or young at heart have a choice this morning. You can come up and sit right in front, or you could stay with your families. I'm going to be in a different place than usual. Can you see me down there? Yeah? Okay. So does anyone know what holiday is coming up this week? Not quite. Thanksgiving. Yes, it's Thanksgiving. I remember one very special Thanksgiving from a long time ago when I was a child. My grandpa came to visit us for the holiday, and he had an amazing story to tell us. He had been doing some research called genealogy and discovered who some of our ancestors were from a long time ago. Some he had traced back as far as the late 1500s and early 1600s. My great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were Pilgrims. Their names were John Alden, Priscilla Mullins, and William Brewster. So this is the story that I was told and learned many times when I was growing up. A long time ago in England, your ancestors were separatists. They believed that the Church of England was too much like the Catholic Church, and they wanted to separate from it. But they couldn't, because they were not free to practice their own religion. So a group of separatists got together and moved to the Netherlands. There, they were free to practice their religion as they wished, but they didn't like that their children were growing up more Dutch than English. Their children were learning a new language and new customs. So they decided they needed to move again. This time, they decided to settle in the New World, on our continent where we are now, North America. Your ancestors went back to England to gather supplies, more people, and 2 ships. Some of the people who joined them for the trip were not actually separatists. They were called strangers. One of them was a cooper. That means he made barrels. And his name was John Alden. Their minister chose not to go with them, but one of their elders did. He was the person who led their worship services, and his name was William Brewster. So soon after they began their voyage, one of the ships ran into trouble and turned back for repairs. The other one, the Mayflower, continued on and first saw land at Cape Cod. They settled at Plymouth, and there they struggled to survive. They were not prepared for a New England winter, did not have enough food, and got very sick. Over half of them died that first winter. Among the survivors was a young woman named Priscilla Mullins. She married John Alden, and theirs was the first marriage in Plymouth Colony. Their story was so well known, a poet wrote a famous poem about them many years later. The next year continued to be hard for the Pilgrims. Although they did recover from the sickness that had plagued them, they did not know how to grow their own food in the New World. An Indian named Squanto came to their rescue and taught them how to grow food. He showed them how to plant corn, beans, and squash all together, and he was able to do that because he spoke English. He learned English a long time ago when he was a younger man and had been captured by some bad traders and taken to England. Somehow, he eventually managed to escape and was able to come back home, although by then, most of his tribe had died. The Pilgrims, your ancestors, were grateful for Squanto and for their first harvest. So they held a celebration. The Pilgrims were there, and the Native Americans were there, and they feasted together and played games together for several days. That was the first Thanksgiving, the same holiday we celebrate now, all these years later. We are grateful for the Pilgrims. They struggled greatly and at a huge cost to secure religious freedom for themselves and for us. Your religion is the same as your ancestors, the Pilgrims, and that is why we are able to go to the church we do now, and that is why we have a plain church with clear windows and white walls and no statues or crucifixes anywhere. That was the story I learned as a child. The story I know now is very different in some important ways, which we'll be talking about during the rest of the service. But for those of you who will be leaving to go to your religious education classes, I'm going to ask you to think about a couple questions, and maybe you could talk about them with your teachers or your families later on. I'm wondering a couple of things. Is the story that I learned when I was a kid about Thanksgiving the same story you've learned? How is your family's story of Thanksgiving either the same or different? And if Squanto were my ancestor instead of the Pilgrims, how do you think I would have told the story? How would Squanto's family story be the same or different from my family story? So that's some food for thought. I am thankful for each of you who are part of a church this morning. Thank you for being here and listening to my story. And we'll sing you off to your classes now. If he doesn't come up, I will. If he comes up by himself, I won't.
Okay.
Our Heritage Minute this morning is remembering in 1878, on this very day, 140 years ago, Reverend Walter Copeland was installed as the fourth settled minister of First Unitarian. During his 11-year ministry, this church survived economic troubles that plagued the nation as well as the church, and it grew in size and stature in the community. Charles Lytle, the author of Freedom Moves West, the history of the westward movement of Unitarianism, noted that, quote, to the credit of the Board of Trustees, several of whom were officers of the Union Pacific and Burlington Railroads, freedom was never denied Copeland to plead for justice for labor unions and troubled farmers, end quote. A contemporary publication, Unitarian publication called Unity, carried an article praising the Omaha congregation of the time, noting that, quote, the liberals of Nebraska are, as a whole, very radical, having cut loose entirely from the moorings of the old theology, and they can be reached by no form of religion but their own.
hidden from the words of Rachel Naomi Raymond. Hidden in all stories is the one story. The more we listen, the clearer the story becomes. Our true identity, who we are, why we are here, what sustains us, is in this story.
The next story I'm going to tell is not actually mine. It is a story as I imagine it could be told with just as much legitimacy and historical accuracy as any other story ever could be told. This is the story of a man named Tisquantum. You may have heard of him as Squanto. A long time ago, a man named Tisquantum lived. He was part of a people who called themselves the Wampanoag, a people who came to this continent thousands of years ago and who still exist today. The Wampanoag believed, and still do, that every day is a day of thanksgiving. This Thursday, Tisquantum's descendants will observe a day of remembrance, a day when they remember the struggles of their people and honor their ancestors. Without Tisquantum, there would be no Thanksgiving holiday this week. Tisquantum grew up as a part of the Patuxet tribe. He was resourceful, kind, courageous, and tenacious. He was also primarily responsible for the survival of the Pilgrims, who were Europeans and who arrived on his land in 1620. While he was growing up in the early 1600s, there were as many as 12,000 native people living on the shore of Massachusetts and the outlying islands. As a young person, Tisquantum knew of the English and other white-skinned people as people with whom he could trade goods. He could hunt and kill a beaver and trade the skin to a person from a European boat for a hat or a coat or an axe or some other valuable item. So, when a European trader named Thomas Hunt asked Tisquantum and his friends to come onto his ship to trade, he was not afraid. But Thomas Hunt tricked Tisquantum and his friends. He kidnapped them and sailed back to Europe, where he sold Tisquantum to Spanish monks who wanted to convert him to Christianity. Tisquantum was taken from his family and friends and everything he knew, and he was forced to work in a strange land and learn about a religion that was completely foreign to him. But Tisquantum did not lose hope. He somehow found his way to England and learned the English language. He returned to his homeland through a job as a translator on a merchant ship to North America from England. When he returned home, he discovered that his entire tribe and family had been killed by illnesses brought to his land by European ships. When he returned home, the 12,000 people who had lived there had become only 3,000. I imagine Tisquantum might have, understandably enough, felt angry toward the English who settled on his ancestral lands. He could have turned his back on them. He could have held a grudge against them. He certainly didn't have reason to trust them. After all, he had not had the best experiences with their kind up until now. But Tisquantum did not show anger toward these new settlers. He took pity on them and he helped them. During the first winter in Plymouth, about half of the settlers died. As winter turned to spring, Tisquantum visited them often. He spoke English, which he had learned as an enslaved person in Europe. He taught them how to plant native crops. He showed them the Wampanoag method of farming, which was different from how they did things in England. Tisquantum explained to the settlers that 3 crops must be planted together and in a particular order. First corn, then beans, then squash. The corn stalks act as poles for the beans as they grow. The squash grow as vines around the lower part of the corn. The wide leaves of the squash cover the soil, making it difficult for weeds to grow. The beans help keep the soil healthy and fertilize the corn. Tisquantum also showed them how to use fish as fertilizer. Thanks to Tisquantum's help, the Pilgrims learned how to survive and farm in a land very different from their own. They celebrated their successful harvest the same way they would have celebrated a harvest in their homeland, with 3 days of feasting, games, and parading around shooting off rifles. The Wampanoag were not actually invited to the feast, but they came because they heard the gunshots. When they saw that the English people were not preparing for war, but celebrating, they decided to stay and join in the celebration. The peaceful coexistence between the English and the Wampanoag lasted only a few seasons. That is why, for the Wampanoag who are alive today, Thanksgiving is a day of remembrance. As Wampanoag tribal elder Gladys Wittes has said, "Every day is a day of thanksgiving to the Wampanoag. We give thanks to the dawn of the new day, at the end of the day, to the sun, to the moon, for rain, for helping crops grow. There is always something to be thankful for." Our meditation this morning will be a sung meditation. We're going to play it through once ahead of time, and then we will sing together, and I'm going to encourage us to do it more than 3 times. So how about 5? Can we do 5? Okay. At this time of Thanksgiving, while people all over gather in their harvests, we too gather our own gifts in an expression of gratitude for this beloved community of faith. If you are new or visiting with us for the first time today, please allow the basket to pass you by. You are our guests. The morning's offering will now be received.
Stories from the words of Tim O'Brien. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave a TED Talk in July of 2009 on the danger of the single story. She is, in her words, a storyteller who was born and raised in Nigeria, then came to the US at the age of 19 in order to go to college. She says that the way to create a single story is to show people as one thing and only one thing over and over again and then that is what they become. For so long, our culture has held onto a single story of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims were heroes who suffered for the cause of religious freedom. The Indians were savages to be feared, with a few friendly exceptions like Squanto. The first Thanksgiving was the one held in 1621, when the Pilgrims and the natives came together to eat turkey and stuffing and so many of the foods we now consider traditional. And yes, that was a little bit of sarcasm. They never had turkey or stuffing. Adichie, in her TED Talk, explains that it is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. How they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. And that power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. One of my favorite stories she tells goes like this. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. This is not because I am a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I love this story because it is so startling and so illustrative of her points. When we hold a single story of another country or another culture or another person or a holiday, we will undoubtedly get it wrong, or at the very best, incomplete. This morning, with the holiday coming later this week, I chose to tell stories about Thanksgiving. But these lessons are just as applicable to the many stories of our lives. Stories both big and small, stories which take on mythical proportions, and stories we're not even conscious of telling ourselves. As Adichie says, stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. With this in mind, what stories will you tell in your family this week? Please rise, either in body or spirit, and join us in singing the final hymn, number 349. Today we are thankful for you and what you bring to our church.
Your spirits, talents, generosity and imagination, dedication reaffirming our fellowship and create our beloved community. Our heartfelt thanks to you on this day and for all days to come.
For those who embrace Thanksgiving as a day to honor the gifts of family, friendship, abundance, security, we celebrate with you and join our voices to hold aloft all sacred blessings.
For those who hold Thanksgiving as a day of sadness, who mourn for the hurt and loss of Native peoples, who are lonely, who grieve the loss of those dear and beloved, we hold your heartaches and sorrow, so you do not have to carry these burdens alone. Blessings be upon you.
Go out into the world, sharing your stories and gathering the stories of those around you, sharing your truth and gathering the truths of those around you, knowing you are not alone and sharing your presence with those around you. Go now in peace and with gratitude in your hearts. Amen.